Good afternoon, guys. We are beginning a unit on imperialism. This has been assigned to you from the textbook. We will be answering questions this week after we read an Explorer page. And because I kind of needed to make sure that you got the key facts about imperialism, I'm going to have to skip over some of the introductory sections of the textbook. This is the pre-session that will be very beneficial to you to understand imperialism before you start taking answering the questions that go with Explore. I think it's 3 or 4. Anyway, so here's the deal. What exactly is imperialism and how does the idea take hold in Europe? So we're at the end of the 1700s and we're moving into the 1800s and, of course, the Industrial Revolution. This idea of nationalism begins to emerge in Europe, in the European countries. So what exactly is nationalism? Well, nationalism is a strong feeling of connection and or loyalty to where you are raised. In other words, very proud of your country, a strong sense of patriotism. So, because of nationalism, people began to believe that their country was important and that they must gain more importance by attaining political status and power. So, the way to do this came through this idea of imperialism. And imperialism is defined as this: a policy by which one nation controls another, takes over, dominates, usually a smaller or weaker nation. Now, what you have to remember is that Great Britain became the most powerful nation in the world, even more powerful than the Roman Empire, through this idea of imperialism in the 1800s. So, Great Britain came to control more of the world through this idea of imperialism than any other country at any other time period in history. And I find that to be quite fascinating, that this tiny little island nation could become the most powerful nation in the world. So the controlling power is going to do this by obtaining territory, by holding political or economic powers. Now, there were 3 ways that the countries decided that they could do this. This idea of I want control of other countries. And particularly Africa, the whole continent, comes into play because Africa had those resources that became in very high demand in all of Europe as the Industrial Revolution spread. So this imperialistic idea is I want to build an empire. Now, there were 3 ways that these nations got control of other countries. Okay, the first of them being a protectorate. So, with a protectorate, if you were a protectorate of a European nation, then the territory, your land, was ruled not by the mother country, but by the local leaders. However, you had backup support by that foreign state, for example, Great Britain. Now, this allowed the local leaders to gain and maintain some control of what was going on in their nation, but the foreign state, such as Great Britain, maintained a lot of control over this particular territory. Okay. The second option for how these European nations gained control, now that, of course, there were others that are going to be mentioned, Spain, Belgium, France, Italy, all of these European nations were trying to imperialize. Okay, so the second option for how to gain control of a nation or a country was to be a sphere of influence. So here's the idea. One European country, I keep going back to Great Britain, had a special economic relationship with an African country in exchange for protection of invasion from other European nations. So these European nations would kind of work together to decide, well, I want this part of Africa and you want this part, so we'll negotiate. And if I have a sphere of influence here, all other European countries agree not to conduct economic or military activities within that country. So this was how it was beneficial to the African country or territory. It was assured that it would not be attacked, or no other country would try to control it economically. So that was an advantage, sort of a safety measure that these African countries might put into place by becoming a sphere of influence. Okay, and then obviously number 3, the most controlled was the colony idea. So a colony was a territory or a piece of land, that a country that was fully owned by a European nation. And obviously this was the most advantageous for these European nations because they had full access to all of the resources. Okay, so now we want to build an empire. So how did you do it? How do you remember what it means to be an empire in the 1800s? Okay, and this is set up in the form of an acronym to help you remember it. So empire. Okay, so we take with an acronym the first letter of the word, and then the second letter of the word, etc., and we make a easy way to remember something important. Okay, so empires, the E, of course, stands for empire, and you build one of those by acquiring lots of land. Okay, the M within empire, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry guys, I'm having technical difficulties controlling my laptop. Okay, so my video square box of me is in the way. All right, so the M is for military buildup. Obviously, if you are going to be a powerful nation, you need to be able to protect your own nation as well as the countries for which you have some control over. You need to be able to protect them too from foreign invasion. And of course, the competition was tough because these European nations were competing for resources. Okay, so the P is for political power. Okay, you needed to gain a lot of political influence in the area, okay, of Europe, obviously, but within Africa as well. And you gained political power, of course, by becoming a profitable nation with a strong economy. And that meant that you were industrialized and you were accessing all of the technologies and the resources for your advantage. Okay, next. Please tell me it's not gonna, I'll just do it this way. Yeah, right. Okay. So the I, just a minute, sorry guys, is for an industrialized nation. And this idea that I'm industrialized and I want to spread my Western ideas to make your country better, the technology that I have gained and the medicines and of course my culture, I want to share these with you because I'm superior. All right, here the R has 2 possible representations. Resources, of course, raw materials like your rubber and your oil and your diamonds, those kinds of things, and your trees, your natural resources. If you wanted to be an empire, you had to have access to all those things. That was mandatory. And also, you were somewhat committed to spreading your religion. If you'll recall, back during the Age of Exploration, that also was one of the important things, is let's spread some Christianity around the world. Okay, so the R is for resources and for religion. Now, this idea of the industrialized nation, these European countries had the idea that they were exceptional, okay, above the rest, superior. So it was expected that these European nations would, because they were exceptional, dominate the world. So that sort of is how did we get to industrialization and the idea of building an empire and dominating throughout the world, particularly again Africa. All right, now I'm going to see if this will switch over to review the textbook assignment, and we're going to look at some of my highlighted notes like we did previously if you've been watching any of these other. Okay, so did I go away? All right, hopefully we've switched over and I can sort of run through these. Okay, so until the 1870s, we get into the 1970s, or excuse me, the 1900s, Europeans had very little knowledge of Africa, didn't really care. But of course, with the Industrial Revolution, that changed. Africa was rich in raw materials, which the expanding European nations found appealing for producing the goods. So these are the countries that got involved. Of course, the European nations, France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, and they hoped to get the resources from Africa. So there was a sudden rush to claim as much of Africa as possible, and this became known as the Scramble for Africa. So an important player that you're going to need to know about is King Leopold, and he'll be in that video about the Congo I hope that you watch. But he was a Belgian ruler, and his main goal was to gain access to the continent's vast supply of natural resources. So he hired an explorer, Henry Morton Stanley, to travel along the Congo River basin. Now, Stanley had some connections, and he used the relationships he had previously developed with some of the locals to persuade them to sign treaties with Leopold. And the idea was that when they signed these treaties, they gave over everything to Leopold. So he kind of snuck in there and got control of this Congo River basin, which is a very important part of the travel and the trade. So Great Britain, France, Portugal, Italy, and Spain and Germany responded. Of course, they were all rushing in to claim these African territories, but Leopold sort of had the upper hand here because he had the Congo River basin for all the trade and the travel. And all these countries became fiercely competitive for resources, and because they were starting to squabble, they decided maybe they'd better meet and negotiate like gentlemen and try to work out how they were going to divvy up Africa. So this was called the Berlin Conference, and the main purpose of the Berlin Conference was to settle ownership claims in the Congo River basin. So at this conference, European powers agreed to make the Congo River basin a neutral site, even though Leopold had sort of claimed it. They sort of decided, not really. So the Congo River basin was a neutral site for European trade, and nobody could own it. Of course, I'm sure that really upset Leopold. But the conference also clarified how European powers would claim African territory. And of course, that goes back to those three ways of control: your protectorate and your colony and your sphere of influence. So if you were going to colonize, this talks about how did you colonize. You had to be physically present in the region and establish troops, government, and commerce to say that you actually had colonized a nation, or you had to pick one of those other two routes. Now, the problem here was that Africa, the Africans, the natives, didn't have any say because they were not invited to attend this Berlin Conference. You can imagine that they had no say in how their own land was going to be divided up, and that kind of really did cause some major tensions. And of course, I'm not going to read all this further to you, but it did lead to some war. Okay, and of course, again, I'm going to let you read what I've highlighted in the rest of this article as well to be able to answer your questions. The bottom line is that most of, due to inferior technology in Africa. Most of these countries really could not fight back and were easily conquered by the European nations. However, and I'm just going to sort of skinny this up for you, there were two that remained independent, and they were Ethiopia and Liberia. Now, next week we're going to get into Northern Africa and parts of China as well, and how the impact of imperialism there, and in some of the Muslim countries as well. So I hope this helps you and that you're having a great week.